Hi, this is the Vermont Institute of Community and International Involvement tonight, talking with our friend and scholar, Kurt Maida, about India today. I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is such an important topic and why I hope people will either see us on CCTV, which is recording this event, and it will be shown later on public access television. CCTV channel used to be 17, I think it's now 317. It will be recorded and shown later. And the reason that we, the Vermont Institute of Community and International Involvement, or VICII, have chosen this topic tonight, number one, is because our friend Kurt Maida was born in India, and he just returned from a trip there, and so he probably will have a lot to say about India today. Second reason is that we have covered before the interesting idea that India is part of a group of nations called BRICS, and that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which seems to be forming a bloc that's independent of both economic developments in the East and the West, particularly independent of the American system of finance and capitalism, which extends between the United States and especially the Western European powers. It seems to be the BRICS nations appear to be developing an independent bloc in order to escape the hegemony of the American dollar and the American and European capitalist system and form their own bloc and their own systems, many of which are probably going to be quite similar to a capitalist model. But we're here today to talk to this topic with Kurt Maida. The other reason that I think India is incredibly important today is that I believe in the New York Times, that India is going to exceed the population of China, and that might happen as early as April of this year, which means that India has become a regional yet global power that people are going to have to pay attention to. And the last reason I think this is important is that India and many of the other, we used to call it the third world. Now I think it's the developing nations in both Latin America, South America, Africa, and some of Asia, that these powers are beginning to challenge the idea that they have to choose either the Western alliance of NATO or the Russian and the Chinese alliance, particularly around the Ukraine war. India has kept itself fastidiously neutral, right, in that struggle, and has not chosen sides. And this is an increasing pattern that we see in the developing world of Latin America and in India in particular, and Africa. So anyway, this is Kurt Maida, who will comment on all these issues on India today and his return from a trip abroad. Okay, so.
Thanks for having me, Sandy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I always enjoy doing our little stints for CCTV in the local community here in Burlington.
And the world.
And the world, right. So, I mean, as Sandy mentioned, I just came back.
You were born there.
I was born there, lived there for about 10 months. Then my family emigrated to the United States at the age of 10 months for me.
So you weren't familiar with India at all, really?
No. I had a short visit when I was 3 years old, and then had a lengthier visit when I was 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And it's been a 40-year absence after that. I did not go back. Did not think I was ever going to go back.
Why?
Made a promise to my younger brother that we would never go back.
Why?
We did not have a good time in 1983. The culture shock was too great for us, for both of us. My brother's 5 years my younger, and my brother was born here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And the patterns, the way things were done, were just so different. It felt like an upside down world. Infrastructure wasn't there. People were dressed differently. And for an 11-year-old immigrant who's just trying to fit in to American rock and roll culture of the early 1980s, it was too honestly upsetting.
How so?
And disturbing.
Why?
Having grown up in northern New Jersey, you saw people that were lower middle class. You didn't see abject poverty.
Mhm.
And
Where were you at that point? What part of India?
oh, okay. So my family is from a state called Gujarat. The language spoken there is called Gujarati.
Mhm.
That's my native language, more so than English, but I'm English dominant. There's about 80 to 90 million speakers of that language. So just to give you an idea, that's more than the number of people that live in Great Britain and speak English. That's more than the number of people, I think, Grant can correct me, that speak French in France. And that's more than the number of people that speak Italian in Italy. Of course, French and English, once you go outside of their defined borders, are much more present and spoken, in the developing world,
Right,
as well as
yeah.
North America and Australia and New Zealand with respect to English anyway. But so it's a language that most people never heard of, yet there are 90 million speakers. That particular state, province in India, also gave birth to Mahatma Gandhi. On the flip side, the current Prime Minister, Modi, and if you don't know anything about politics but know about the arts, the family of Freddie Mercury from Queen.
For the Bohemian Rhapsody
for Bohemian Rhapsody and We Will Rock You and all those other great hits. So his family was originally from that state, so we probably shared a language. But
you don't speak it. Right?
I do. It's my native language.
You do speak it?
It's
How
my
did you
first
learn
language. I spoke it with my parents.
So you speak it fluently?
Absolutely.
Boy, I bet you could get a job at the UN.
I can't read and write it, though. It's a different alphabet. Not even a single letter, but I can speak it fluently. It's my first language. English comes second. English comes second. Right?
English is second.
Right.
But English is sort of a national language of all of India. Is that true?
Yes. The reason I was excited to go back, I was there on a wildlife safari trip. So I was there to track lions and leopards, which I got a chance to do, and that was wonderful. Exceeded my expectations, as I'd just come back from Africa this past summer, and I didn't think that this was an inferior trip with respect to sighting animals. Had a good time. That being said, I was also excited to use my native language there, and hardly got to use it, with the exception of I do have a couple of relatives that are still there that I touch base with, some older aunts, and they're up there in age, and aside from that, I mostly spoke English on this trip. The younger people under the age of 40, did not want to speak the local language.
Did they speak it at all, or is it?
They spoke it at all, but if I would speak to them in their language, they responded back in English. And if I left that particular state and went out of the state, I would be as clueless as you would be or anyone else would be that is not from India, because the language spoken was English.
Wow. Are those native languages disappearing, do you suppose?
I think in part, but it's twofold. It's not because people are drawn to English because it's a unifier, but two things: Hollywood, and then the local industry there is Bollywood.
Right.
So if they spoke a second language, younger people wanted to speak the language that they watched their favorite TV shows and movies in, which is Hindi. I don't speak that language.
And they're very different?
Very different. Even the alphabets are completely different. So even a non-native would notice the alphabets look different. That wouldn't be able to recognize anything. So spoke a lot of English there on the trip. Wasn't expecting that. So English is in fact a unifier. I learned from a couple of relatives who were attorneys there. It's the language of it's the language of the Supreme Court of the country. The Constitution was written in English.
There is a Constitution.
Yeah, it was based on the American Constitution.
Good for them.
It was written by an untouchable in the caste system, and he was the author of the Indian Constitution, largely based on the Constitution was written in 1950. The country achieved independence in 1947 from Great Britain, 2 years after the Second World War. But the Constitution was ratified by the states in 1950.
Well, of course, they can't go to the English Constitution for a model, because there isn't
Because
one.
there is no such thing.
There is no such thing,
There's
correct.
No such thing.
So I'm glad they looked to
And the language of the courts in the country, state courts, as well as the Supreme Court of the country, all arguments are done in English. All decisions are published in English. I met a young attorney on the leopard safari. He was about 22, 23 years old. And I was asking him the language that he was a student of admiralty law. That was going to be his specialty. And I asked him, the language of the admiralty courts in India. He said definitively English.
Wow.
And he was going to London to get some advanced degree there.
I wonder if that's true in the other colonialized countries. For instance, in French West Africa, I wonder if that is the lingua franca is French.
Yeah,
Probably.
I know in a number of other former African colonies, English is predominant, and I think they're making attempts to try to reduce the role of English. In India, there was an attempt to do that. It doesn't seem successful. If anything, the influence of largely American pop culture has made English more appealing for the under 40 crowd and the educated crowd. That's critical to know. If people are not educated, there's a lesser likelihood that they're going to speak English. But even a couple of family members that I had that were not terribly educated, they can string together a sentence by having watched enough, Tom Cruise and Sylvester Stallone movies. And I was impressed by how they were able to string words of English together to form short sentences and actually communicate and understand, the language, our language of English.
We're looking at a map provided by Ed.
Yeah, so, I was on the northwest coast.
Northwest coast,
right,
over
I
here?
can point to it if you want me.
Yeah.
Right here.
Okay. So, was that in a city? Yeah?
Is it true that there's such a thing as an Indian standard English, just as there's British English and American English?
Sure. I mean, when I was speaking there, people had to kind of pay attention closely, even amongst English speakers, because they're not as used to an American English accent, unless they're really big fans of, I had a cousin who understood me fine, and he insisted on speaking English with me, even though he's a little older than I am. Because he's just a huge fan of Hollywood movies and pop music, English, American and English pop music. So certainly, Grant, there is an Indian English. The words are the same. However, the accent's different. They have an easier time comprehending, British people speaking English because they have a greater, a longer history with Great Britain. So that English is, it's easier for them to understand. They'll have to listen to me a little more closely, or to an American a little more closely to get what they're saying. Except for the younger people who were largely indoctrinated by Hollywood and American pop music. Will get, I couldn't believe how much hip hop and rap music I was hearing, American rap music. I don't think people knew some of the nasty language that was said in the songs, but they were singing them. Yeah. So I mean that's on the language. But you mentioned an interesting point. In the month of April, the New York Times is predicting that India's population is going to exceed China's, and there's going to be that 1,500,000,000 child born there, and that will exceed the population of China at that point. So, not in terms of concentrations that we're used to, but in the overall world picture, 1 out of every 5 people is from India. Not even South Asian I'm talking about, but India. But if you take South Asian, you're probably talking about you add the populations in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that's an additional 500 million.
Of course, those
people.
are now independent, though.
These are all independent
Which is, I
countries.
did want
Right.
to address somewhat of the
And partly
history
Nepal,
of India. Nepal, was Nepal part of India?
No, it was
Yeah.
never part of India proper, but there are Indian people
Yes,
living there,
And
and
Hindi-
the language.
and religion, correct?
Correct. The two religions in Nepal are Buddhism and Hinduism. They're both originated in India.
Right, okay,
Yeah,
so
Indian subcontinent.
getting back to, I guess the historical past is what I would love to talk a little bit
Sure.
to you about. Okay, so India was an independent kind of a region or a kingdom
Sure.
until the British
Yeah.
or to the East India Company.
The East India Company got a charter from Queen Elizabeth I.
Right, which is
in
when?
1600.
1600, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
right.
1600, 1601, the first contingent or ships owned by the East India Company. Again, a private corporation, not different from Microsoft or Amazon or IBM. Yeah, very powerful.
Oh, Lockheed Martin.
Well, Lockheed Martin, right? A powerful corporation that went to India to do business
In 1600.
in 1600.
Kind of the dawn of English imperialism.
Really the dawn, very early.
Right. Well,
Very
they'd already
early.
gotten, I think, Scotland and Ireland.
Yes, yeah, in terms of the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm. And of course the United States.
And our 13 colonies.
The 13 colonies, right.
The 13 colonies in North America.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but it was a company rather than the government.
Right.
Which,
It's important to distinguish, where our history here deviates from that of India's, was that the 13 colonies were administered by the British government.
Right.
Where India was doing business, the different regional kings and Mughal emperors were doing business with the EIC, which is short for East India Corporation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and that was an English corporation.
It was an English
But
corporation.
it was militarized. Didn't it have its own military?
They had a security force.
Called a security force.
It was a security force
that was
well
allowed.
equipped.
I mean, was there a central government which?
You should listen to the fucker, okay?
Central government of the United Kingdom.
No, India.
There wasn't a central government. So India in the 1200s was invaded from the west by Arabs, and they established a Islamic state in India. We kind of know it as the Mughal Empire. They had their distinct, beautiful architecture and all of that. But they brought Islam to the Indian subcontinent. In different parts of India, presently Pakistan on the east side, Bangladesh, and then there are different pockets within India itself that have, majority to large Islamic populations as a result of that Arab invasion in the 1200s. So the Arabs were, the Muslim influence on India lasted for about 400 years up until the British came.
But the British didn't come. It was the East India Company.
It was the East India Company,
okay,
right? Yeah, again, important that you.
And what did they do?
distinction.
Did they sort of conquer India then?
They did not conquer. They were doing business with the Mughal emperor, and the Mughal emperors. Their capital was Delhi, which now it's. The capital of the country is New Delhi, but it was in that same region where they had most of their assets and controlled much of the Indian subcontinent. Not all of it, but much of it from there. And the East India Company became more and more involved with getting different kinds of land grants from the Mughal emperors, and also giving the Mughal emperors things that they wanted, in terms of trade.
And money.
And money, yeah, but mostly it was about trade.
Yeah.
It was about things that they could not get in India that were available through Europe and through the Middle East. And then in turn, the East India Company was able to get a lot of things that they couldn't get and that they were interested in acquiring from India.
So little by little then
Right. So the big land grab, so to speak, was originally in Europe, it's known as the War of Austrian Succession.
That's right.
Which
right,
in
right.
our country, we know as the French-Indian
Oh,
War.
so India was involved in that.
India was involved, but it was involved from the standpoint of competing colonial powers
Right, always, right.
had a fight. So who was involved? The French, the Dutch, the Portuguese,
Right.
and the British. It was at the end of that war, the French and Indian War that we call here in the United States, our founding father, George Washington, was actively
Right.
involved in.
1753.
Right.
Yeah.
That not only did Great Britain acquire a domination over Canada by
Right.
taking over Quebec
And
from
the
the French.
United States.
Right.
Right.
But they also basically became regional hegemons in the subcontinent
Right.
of India.
Right. Boy. So many people call that war actually the First World War.
You could look at it that
Yeah,
way.
because it was all these global powers competing with each other over dominance
Yeah.
basically in the colonial world.
Colonial world, which
Right.
includes, our part of the world.
Yes.
And I think it's probably one of the wars that in American schools, I can say my experience,
Mhm.
that I knew the least amount.
Exactly,
Of,
me too.
The focus is usually on the Revolutionary War and
Right.
the Civil War, and then of course the two world wars in the 20th century.
Mhm.
But not so much.
But it's an incredibly important.
Incredibly important
Incredibly
in
yeah.
terms of its impact on the history and the landscape of the world right now.
Exactly.
And power dynamics.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And honestly, the ascendancy of the language you and I are speaking.
I
to
know,
one
I know,
another. Yeah.
including to
Yeah.
the north of us in Quebec,
In
because
Quebec,
that's where
sure.
Quebec was defeated by,
Right.
essentially by Ottawa,
Right.
in a
right.
lot of ways, and that's when Canada began to have all its problems in a way between the English speakers
Yeah.
and then the Quebec.
And had that war turned out differently, the language that we're speaking in right now could have been French.
Or Spanish.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Because of the two big combatants were the French and the British.
Right.
More so than the
Exactly.
Portuguese and Dutch.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so then India by that point is essentially conquered by
the East India Company.
not the government.
Not the government. The government of Great Britain did not come in
Mhm.
until 1857. So the East India Company, they dominated for a little over a century,
Mhm.
and they were able to exact taxes on the population. They removed much of the wealth of the country in the form of gold and diamonds and textiles. And they also created an incredible cottage industry for Great Britain
Right.
in terms of
Textiles, right?
textiles
Mhm.
and exclusivity. So not only was, and I'm not limiting this to the population of the subcontinent of India, I'm sure it extended to Africa,
Right.
some of their, and the 13 colonies here, but raw materials were taken out of India, manufactured in Britain, and then sold back to
Exactly.
India
That was
at a significant
right.
premium.
And that was called I believe, the mercantile system.
That was the mercantile
Yeah, right,
system,
right.
and it basically created a buttress for these industry upon industry, home industry in Great Britain,
Right.
which by the 1960s, Great Britain faced near economic collapse because at that point, not only had they lost their colonies in South Asia, most of their African colonies were gone too. So these markets that they dominated, had monopolies over, were basically, disappearing.
Right. The interesting thing too is that they lost their empire essentially after World War II.
Yeah.
With the colonies in Africa, in Asia, kind of declaring their own independence and beating the British. I mean,
in part,
yeah.
you don't want to credit, evil, but the damage that the Germans did, the Nazis did to Great Britain, made it impractical and unfeasible for Britain to have the size of the empire that they had.
But guess who replaced it or tried to?
Right.
The United States.
The United States,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
They stepped in. However, without the colonial
Right.
the actual physical colonial, dominance that Great Britain had in terms of administering countries. The United States, corporations had significant roles, and they continue to have significant roles in Latin America
Right.
and the economies of countries. However, one can argue, with the exception potentially of Iraq, that the U.S. government did not necessarily go in and run the show. The corporations.
No, right.
Corporations have.
But the power of the United States made that
Ascended.
feasible.
Yeah.
And the United States came out of World War II really as the only victor in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And they kind of, or at least attempted to replace the old English Empire. I remember that Winston Churchill said he saw himself as presiding over the demise of the English Empire.
Yeah.
And that was sort of, not militarily so much, replaced by the hegemony of the U.S.
Yeah,
right?
the United States and the U.S. dollar.
Right, exactly.
The U.S. dollar, and that continues.
And that
today.
continues today.
Yeah.
But now let me talk about one other thing in terms of Indian history that I don't think that most Americans know anything about, and that is the partition movement, which happened in the 40s, right after.
Right.
Okay, so India becomes independent of Britain in 1947.
Right.
Okay.
So
what was this partition deal? There was a big article about partition in the New Yorker, which was really excellent to me, because I didn't know very much about it, explaining how violent it was and how it split India basically in two, right?
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
The famous comment that Gandhi made when partition was basically, the news of partition was broken to him.
And what was this partition?
Yeah, it was essentially, the quote was, that my heart has been broken into two pieces.
Yeah.
So partition, there was an Indian independence movement that had started in the 1870s, 1880s against Great Britain's rule over India. It was the independence movement was called the self-rule movement, translating into English. And the self-rule movement consisted of mostly men who were either Hindu or Muslim, and they got together and got along well. Their goals were the same, but as time went on, specifically the Muslim members of this political organization, all very learned men and some women too, but mostly men, began thinking that Muslims needed their own homeland, that they did not have a place in a country that had an 80% Hindu majority, that they would be swallowed up, and there were also going to be some acts of reprisal from the 400 years of Islamic domination of India between the years 1200 and 1600, and much of Indian culture was transformed during that time frame, which I would probably argue continues to this day in large part. And their discomfort with being a minority, Muslims being a minority, about 15 to 20% of the population.
That's all.
Yeah, or even less. I mean, there are Christians and Jews there too, and Buddhists that are still there. That they were not going to get a fair shake, and they lobbied heavily to the British government, as it appeared by the end of the Second World War that Great Britain was now going to,
Have
release.
to leave,
It was going to, because they simply didn't have the manpower, woman power to preside over 400 million people in South Asia, when people didn't have basic infrastructure in Britain because of the German bombing of cities there. They simply didn't have the resources or the labor power. At that point, they were being lobbied heavily by the Islamic contingent in this independence movement to divide the country and give us our own homeland, from which Pakistan was created.
Okay, but wait a minute, let's talk. So why, and then so the British granted that?
Essentially.
Why?
They carved up the subcontinent.
And is that really what the Indians, both Muslim and Hindu, wanted?
Hindus did not want that. certain
Right.
Muslims, and again, out
But the
of
Hindus
fear.
did not.
No, they
Why
wanted
not?
to keep. They wanted to keep it a unified.
And
homeland.
what was the relation between those two religions? Was it nasty and hostile and violent even?
I mean, it's the history is not different than Yugoslavia. If
Right.
anyone knows that.
Yes, right.
People lived together.
Uh-huh.
However, there would be rioting, and there were resentments over time because the culture and the country was changed. During the 400 years of Islamic domination.
Mm-hmm.
Where there were a lot of forced conversions, society changed, women were made to be more modest in dress.
Under the Muslim.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
In line with a lot of the other modest aspects of Islamic culture. Homosexuality was largely frowned upon, which was not the case before.
By the Muslims?
By Muslims, and then further exacerbated by Victorian Britain that was coming
but
into
not by the Hindus.
Not originally, no. I mean, there was also a movement. There's not to completely go off, the track here, but transgendered.
All right, I
people
saw that. There was
were-
an article about that in the Nation last week.
So it wasn't until about 1840 that the British Penal Code that was administered in India specifically made a ban on homosexuality as well as people that were transgendered. And that ban was not lifted until about 5 years ago by the Indian Supreme Court.
Okay, but so it's curious to me that there are partitions.
There were partitions
in the British Empire specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, not to sound conspiratorial, but I'm going to give you the conspiratorial, and I'm saying that.
Look, all a conspiracy is an agreement to do something illegal. It happens all the time.
Right. So whether you look at Rwanda, which was administered by the French, the local population's view, educated population's view, is that they left us in a situation where we're going to be fighting with one another in perpetuity, and we're never going to get ahead. That happened in Rwanda. The seeds that were planted by the French in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis resulted in a genocide in the 1990s.
Okay, so
and similarly in Britain, with respect to British administration, and again, I'm giving you the conspiracy view. I'm not saying that this is the the gospel, but the idea was you're going to keep India, Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh, fighting with one another, which is the case, for decades, and these countries are going to be permanently kept down because of the inordinate amount of defense expenses that they face.
Okay.
Because the partition boundaries, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's other places in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, were unsustainable boundaries, which were going to lead to fighting, and led to about 1 million people
in the partition
killing one another.
Okay, so if we could get that map, perhaps, I'm not certain if Eric can hear me, but so the partition was what? What became what?
So
it was the partition.
So if it were a matter of creating in India and Pakistan 2 states, and then also Burma, the far east.
Yeah, so Burma becomes a state then too?
That's correct. About 2 years later, after India and Pakistan achieved their independence in 1947, Burma, Myanmar now, achieved its independence, all originally part of this wide Indian subcontinent, and Sri Lanka, the island to the south of India.
Okay, and I knew about this first from you as well. I never knew that Burma was part of the Raj, I guess, until we read that book together, George Orwell's Burmese Days, which was Grant's reading that now, right? Okay, so this partition, however, was quite violent.
Quite violent.
Were there forced population exchanges or what?
There certainly were, Sandy, and I think that's what the violence.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed horrendous. I'm not certain why people don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, the violence was horrific.
Why? Because people were moved?
People were moved, people were forced to move, and people were given short periods of time, And again, you're talking about a country at that point that a subcontinent that had been largely rendered poor and
By what? I mean,
by,
I remember this was an interesting question.
so I mean, colonialism in general, whether it was
Yeah.
with respect to the 13 colonies or in Africa or in India, it was essentially it was a vacuum cleaner sucking
Yes,
all the
okay,
wealth
all
out
right.
of
So
these places.
that was an important question that you raised before in my thoughts. And
Yeah.
that was India devastatingly poor prior to the British
Right.
conquest?
So good point. So in 1600, India's world GDP in terms of its proportion of GDP
In 1600.
in 1600 was estimated at 26% of the world's GDP. When the British left in 1947, it was reduced to 4%.
Jesus.
With a population of 400 million people. At that
Okay,
point.
but this to me is an important question, and then maybe we'll go on. But many native or indigenous peoples argue that being taken over by an advanced economic system, which you'd think might mean progress, like
Right.
capitalism,
Right.
like imperialism, actually made their lives poorer.
Yeah.
That in fact, indigenous economies perhaps provide more sustainability than modern economies.
Right.
And that's what kind of you're saying, isn't it?
Well, there's partly that, and then there's partly, again, whether we're talking about, making, Iraqis purchase Exxon oil that is explored and taken out, drilled
And then
from
sent back.
Iraq.
Yeah.
Or it's about, purchasing tailor-made clothing where the cotton is from India and then sent to Great Britain and then sent back.
Which it was.
Yeah, which was, and then it's sold at a premium, significant added,
to poor people.
Premium to poor people, and taking away their industries in the process.
Right. That's what they tried to do in the 13 colonies.
In the 13 colonies. Our founding fathers here were very aware, believe it or not, it's not something that we learn about in school. They were very well aware of what was happening in India and what the East India Company was doing. And, it's not the main reason for our American Revolution, but it's amongst the intellectuals of the time, the Hamiltons, the Jeffersons, the Franklins, they were very astute and very, very knowledgeable about what was transpiring.
Well, that was the age of the Enlightenment, right?
Right.
Okay, so, all right, getting back then to partition.
Yeah.
Violent, however, these new states emerge, correct?
Right.
And so I guess to get us up to date, what happened then to India? Did it remain poor between 1947, say, and present, right?
Yeah.
But it has increased in your mind in becoming a real regional power, or what's the deal?
Right. So, I mean, the country was extremely poor,
After
after the
partition.
independence, whatever you want to call it.
There's one region that's still contested, correct, Kashmir?
Correct. So the lines, again, going back into partition, the way it was done, there was a plebiscite everywhere around the country, the subcontinent.
Which means a vote.
A vote, right. People were allowed to vote and vote which way they wanted to go. Did they want to become part of this new Pakistan, or did they want to remain with India? And you had intense lobbying efforts by local regional leaders. Stay with us. No, come over. Stay with us. So what you had was a development of, and I'm taking Burma out of the picture right now, is not just a Pakistan on the west and India on the east, but there was Pakistan, then there was East Pakistan on the other side.
Right, but there was separated.
Separated by an enormous Indian heartland in the middle. And then there were also some moves to take certain parts of India in the south that had large Muslim contingents, large Islamic populations, and also have that as part of Pakistan. It did not prevail, the southern part of it. But
so that remains in India.
That remained in India. Again, heavy lobbying by, Hindu leaders giving the local Muslim clerics and the population's assurances that they would be given full free religious rights to
Mhm.
practice, and even bribes to
Mhm.
local leaders to get the local population to, vote a certain way,
Mhm.
and they remain that way. But on the east and the west coasts of the country, they both decided to form a new country called Pakistan, East and West Pakistan.
Okay,
So that has resulted in an impact on India today, because the province known as Kashmir, they had a great deal of difficulty deciding.
right.
And that's where the fighting happened, where the population is majority Muslim, but they had a Hindu king who appealed to the British as well as to religious-wise, the Hindu leadership in India for assistance, for military assistance, because he did not want to become part of Pakistan.
Okay, so Kashmir is disputed.
Kashmir is disputed, and now at this point, both countries, India and Pakistan, for quite some time now, have had nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah,
So it's
right,
a flash.
right,
So it's Kashmir is a flashpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Kashmir is a
Unknown to
flashpoint.
many people in the
Yeah,
United States.
yeah.
Okay, so
Beautiful country too.
what about India today? Okay,
So-
it's led by a man named Modi,
Right,
Is
so-
he the prime minister?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Modi is
He's a
M-O-D-I. He is a Hindu, and he belongs to a political party that I guess I'm trying to use bland, neutral
Yes.
language, but it appeals heavily to the populist sentiment of 80% of the population.
Which-
80% of the population is Hindu,
Yeah.
and he tries, to give people an idea of what it's sort of like, is in the United States with I would say probably an 80% Christian population, maybe, or maybe even higher, making issues out of things, and I'm using an analogy, the war on Christmas, telling 80% of the population that they're being attacked, they're being attacked, they're being attacked.
So he's been kind of labeled in the Trump camp, correct?
Kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. However, after having been there on the ground, at the same time, this populism
Mm-hmm.
has also, on the side note, for people that are not really that interested in the polemics, there's been a tremendous amount of infrastructure development that he's helped, and people credit him, specifically his administration, with respect to building roads,
Mm-hmm.
access to clean water, access to clean bathrooms, fixing up the airports so that they don't look like developing world airports anymore. They look like
Shiny new ones.
shiny new ones.
Mm-hmm.
Making the trains work. So, it can be looked at as dangerous. Using the old Mussolini example, having the strong man, but he made the trains work on time. And there's a certain beauty to that for a portion of the population, as well as to visitors. Oh, okay, everything's working okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it remains to be seen how,
But is he, I think he's also been labeled in the West as, I guess the word used would be fascism, although I don't know what that really means, especially
Right.
as it's applied to India.
right.
I guess nationalist, militarist.
Nationalists, most certainly. Again, I'm comparing my memories from that I had in 1983 to the present. I don't remember seeing too many Indian flags in 1983. I don't even think I saw one at the airport. And Indian flags are everywhere in the country.
Yeah.
Everywhere. You have mottos, on walls and
Saying what?
murals. Clean India, modern India, new India. Incredible, visit India. All these. So he's instilling. Now again, you can certainly interpret it that as, well, is that 1933 Germany, or or is it just he's trying to instill pride in a very divided country that has 78 languages, 13 of which are official languages, and the unspoken language of communication is English, a foreign language.
Well, not, essentially it's almost not a foreign language anymore, right?
Oh, no, foreign in terms of its Origins. It's origin.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so, tell us then, you were there last in the 80s, is that true?
I was there in 1983.
Okay, which you hated, you said.
Yeah, I mean the infrastructure, the amount of the lack of a visible middle class was
Shocking?
was shocking. Yeah, when you're coming from a country that prides in our middle class, which unfortunately is also shrinking here too.
Yes, right.
But there was what I noticed was I would probably say 30 to 40% of the people were still quite poor, but there was a great deal of affluence and a very solid middle class this time, traveling domestically on planes, on first class trains, car ownership, which was largely reserved for the wealthy in that country in 1983, is something that the middle class can aspire to, having their own car.
Okay, so you liked it better, first of all, right? Well, how about with women?
It was more comfortable.
Yeah.
So the male-female relationships that I saw there, in terms of how the two genders interact, women seemed a lot more independent. There were many more female business owners. There were women in commerce, women younger than the age of 40. Now, I'm not calling this progress, but from a standpoint of choice, I think it's progress. They were dressing the way they wanted to dress.
Western.
Which was Western.
Right.
Jeans, short skirts, heels. And, if they wanted to, for religious ceremonies or cultural ceremonies, they wore traditional clothing, but it was something that was in large part relegated to special occasions where the clothing of the day, a fair number of older women were wearing what we would call comfortable Western clothing.
Okay, we probably should, I would welcome any questions or comments from our audience if there are some. Otherwise, I did want to ask Kurt a couple more of your impressions, including what is the situation with poverty that you saw, but also, is India kind of on the rise? What's going on in the terms of global superpower politics? What's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the points when you started out the conversation was India being a member of this loose confederacy called BRICS,
right?
BRICS,
which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which seems to be, as you said, a rather loose confederation of nations, which are really challenging the economic dominance of the West.
Of the West, specifically the United States and the European Union.
Here we go, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And one on each continent, which I find interesting.
Right, yeah, there's a potential,
With none in North America.
None in North America. Right.
That's it.
Yeah. So now two of the five members of BRICS, are certainly, they have an adversarial, unfortunately, but they have an adversarial relationship, being India and China.
Right.
So whether or not
both nuclear
powers, and both have an adversarial relationship because there's
on the borders,
right. And the close relationship that China has with India's main adversary, military adversary, which is Pakistan. They've had a strong relationship for close to 60 years, China and Pakistan. So whether or not BRICS is really able to get off the ground and really, if it's able to replicate the unity that the European Union and the United States has, that's questionable because China and India are in this pact. But there's certainly a different point of view expressed on the ground in India that I found with respect to the war in Ukraine.
Right. What was that?
The conversations that I had with more educated people, a couple of people in my family, was that, and I'm
Go
giving you
ahead.
an unfiltered comment, Ukraine is part of Russia.
And so, in a sense,
End of sentence.
right, right. Oh, so,
Yeah.
so in a sense, it was the same finding as
Yeah.
our colleague Erica Niero found in Africa.
Yeah.
That there's more favorability toward Russia
Yeah.
than you might guess here, certainly.
Certainly,
Right.
and and again to give people a full picture. In addition to this natural affinity that comes from Cold War alliances,
Exactly.
That people in India have towards Russia.
Favorable.
Yeah. The other part of it is that Russia has negotiated some fairly attractive petroleum oil deals with India to keep a loose group of countries, as part of its oil market. So when I was in India, I, doing the conversion from their currency, they're called rupees, to U.S. dollars, and they use the metric system as opposed to our, the English common system that we use with respect to weights and measurements, trying to figure out how much a gallon of gas costs.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to basically come to a conversion of about $5.50 a gallon,
Mm-hmm.
which in the United States that would probably lead to the change of a political administration and at the White House, but that was considered a good price in a country that's still poor. And from what I understand, before the Russians cut some of these sweet deals with the Indian government and Indian oil producers, the price of gasoline, as we call it, was closer to $8 a gallon there. So I mean, I was given a couple of rides by some relatives, and I was looking at the the gas station pumps and all that, and doing the conversion and thinking, boy, and some of these new people that were just getting keys to cars in that country, thinking, how would they pay $8 a gallon on incomes that are significantly lower. Nice photo op of 3 BRICS members.
Which is?
I'm not sure. We have
no, Putin's not. Oh yes, it is. Yes, of course.
We have Vladimir Putin from Russia, Modi in the middle, Narendra Modi in the middle, and Xi Jinping of China. Well, again, like I said, nice photo op, but I don't know that the 2 guys on the right get along that well. It's a strange.
Well, I don't know if Russia gets along with China either.
Yeah.
However,
they've had their ups and
they've
downs.
had their hostilities. But the thing that's so interesting to me, one of the reasons I think is my office is here in this building called the African Association of Africans Living in Vermont, is getting a different view on, for instance, the war in Ukraine, because the colonized nations in Latin America, in Africa, and in India, and in Asia, some really have a different view about Russia and China than what we do.
Look, I mean, there's an allegation that, Pakistan, which was always firmly during the Cold War in the U.S. camp,
yes, right,
and the U.S. used Pakistan as a launching base during the Soviet-Afghan War successfully, which may have led to the Soviet Empire basically going bankrupt.
Yeah, right.
The prior prime minister of Pakistan, his name was Imran Khan, handsome, old cricket player who became prime minister of the country. There were allegations that when he, for the first time, warmed up to Putin in Russia, that the United States had something to do with his ouster.
Of course.
And he is no longer the prime minister.
Yeah, that's not a surprise.
Yeah, because he did the unthinkable for Pakistan, which was solidly in the U.S. camp for a long time, since John Foster Dulles first visited Pakistan in the early 1950s and during Eisenhower's administration, that the Pakistan and Russia don't have anything to do with one another. They don't have anything good to say about one another. When Prime Minister Khan of Pakistan entertained Putin coming to Islamabad, their capital, the next thing he knew, he was out of a job.
Well, that happens everywhere, if you think about it. any nation which appears to be leaning toward, specifically Russia, not so much China, but Russia.
Yeah.
The United States always tries to overthrow and get regime change in those countries.
Yeah.
Really, essentially, I think that's really probably what happened in Ukraine too. You know, in 2014, when the kind of the pro-Russian Ukrainian president was chased out to be replaced by a president that was favorable to the EU, to NATO, and to the United States. I mean, this is part of the Cold War. But the other thing that I find more and more interesting, because it sort of has a lot transformed my thinking, is that after World War II, when these colonial nations were seeking independence and seeking other modes of economy other than dependence on the white European powers, Russia actually helped them.
Yes.
And so that's why they're not going to be anti-Russia now. I don't think. I might be wrong. I guess I'm asking your opinion on that. But they seem
Russia, Russia not only provided them, economic assistance and military assistance, they also provided them with an economic model, which many countries in and I use the term South,
the developing world,
that it appeared to the leaders in those countries, the more populist leaders in those countries, that the system of capitalism that was espoused by Western Europe and the United States was not a feasible system for countries that had, poverty levels that exceeded 50%.
Right.
And that trickle down theory,
Cuba too.
Trickle down theory of, acquisition of wealth was simply not acceptable, and was not quick enough in terms of developing, providing, sustainable economic results for people. People needed food. People needed medical care. Not notions about freedom and, other types of, more, concepts, abstract concepts. And the system that Russia was offering was something that was a little bit more practical.
And also appealing,
especially for countries that had excessive numbers.
I'll tell you one other thing, and then maybe we should ask for questions before we wrap up. It was not appealing to those countries which had been colonized by the white European capitalist powers. The main ones: France, England, Holland to a certain extent, Portugal,
Belgium.
Those countries had, according to those colonized countries, had been exploited. So they're not going to turn to those countries for assistance as they gain independence.
Not without a grain of salt. In terms of the advice that we're providing.
So their view is enormously different, I suppose, than the views of the West.
And honestly, because regardless of our disagreements with China about different things, China has made tremendous inroads in Africa.
Exactly. Well, so has Russia too.
But China doesn't have a history of colonializing these powers, and so there's no negative racial baggage.
There's no slave trade, as you pointed out to me once.
There's no slave trade, and there's no real racial baggage that China has when they show up in Uganda to build roads.
Russia doesn't really either.
And Russia did not either. They did not have colonies in the developing world where, apartheid type systems were implemented, for a ruling class and a
So India is then on the rise, wouldn't you say?
It appears that way. I think, they have significant hurdles to overcome. Their expenditures in areas of defense are quite debilitating.
Like ours.
However, we are, fortunately, we are
at this point
a wealthy country still.
At this point, right?
But we are a rich country, if not the richest, and India is not. So having a large military defense budget of having to buy extremely sophisticated fighter planes and keeping the nuclear arsenal up to snuff is a huge cost And it's, it's often, it comes down to guns or butter,
Yes, right.
whether or not
According
you're
to
gonna,
my economics college handbook.
right, whether or not you're gonna
Right, guns or
provide
butter, right.
the population with certain social benefits,
Mhm.
which are practically non-existent in
Mm-hmm.
India, or do you keep the country safe from, actual land armies and or, proxies through
Mhm.
terrorist actions, in quotes.
However, it does seem to be, in your opinion, a power to watch on the global.
If not for any other reason, the fact that the population is going to exceed that of China's
Exactly.
in 2 months
Right. Wow.
from the date of this show.
Okay, are there any questions or comments from our audience, or are we going to say goodnight for now, I guess? And I just want to announce what we are also doing next week for the Vermont Institute of Community and International Involvement, or VICII. Next week, we will be interviewing and with an in-person hybrid audience, Eugene Bergman, who is a city councilor in Burlington from Ward 2, who is going to speak about the resolution that's going to be placed on our town meeting ballot. That ballot item is, people are going to be asked to approve whether there should be a citizens oversight committee, some sort of a commission over the police, over the mayor, and over the police commission, which will have the power to fire a police chief and maybe fire individual police officers for derelictions of duties. This is a citizens commission. I don't exactly know how that citizens commission would be elected or appointed. However, it is a very important ballot item. We will be interviewing one of his chief proponents next week, Councilor Bergman, and I'm hoping to have both an in-person audience here at AALB at 20 Allen Street on the 3rd floor, and also join us on Zoom. On the 15th, we will have the opponent of that same resolution, City Councilor Ben Traverse, and he will be here to speak against it. So join us either in person or on Zoom. I thank Kurt Maida for being with us tonight to talk about this very important, to me anyway, different India that is emerging in the current years. So thanks, Kurt, and thank
you, Sandy.
Thank you, Eric Añero, for all his technological skills in putting this forward. We'll see you in a week or so. Thank you.